Friends, first of all, I'm very grateful that I have been given this opportunity to come and speak at this literary festival which is organized as part of Ragam. You know that the kind of economic regime that we have in India today or over most of the world is something which is generally referred to as neoliberalism. What exactly is neoliberalism? Whenever the word is used, the typical impression which is given is that from now on, in this regime, the market plays a decisive role and the state withdraws. Earlier, we had a system of planning, we had a system of state intervention, we had a system of state controls, but now those controls are withdrawn. The market actually plays a decisive role. That neoliberalism, therefore, is associated with the concept of a withdrawal of the state from economic management. Now, that impression is wrong in at least two very basic ways. It's a completely wrong impression, and that's the first point I want to draw your attention to. It's wrong in two very basic ways. One way it is wrong is that the state does not withdraw. The state continues to intervene in the economy, but in an altogether different manner. Let me say why the state continues to intervene and why the manner of its intervention changes. We live in a world today in which we have globalization of capital flows, not globalization of labor flows, because as you know, there are very strict migration controls which are becoming even stricter. So it's not as if there is a freedom of movement of labor, but there is a freedom of movement of capital. Capital can move. American corporations can invest in China, they can invest in Vietnam, they can invest in Korea, they can invest anywhere. So that capital is moving around. And not just capital in the form of investing in factories, but also finance. We know that in India, a lot of money, simply what is called foreign institutional investment, comes into the economy and is put into the stock market. It can be taken out anytime. So that is capital in the form of finance. That is not capital that is setting up any factories, but just capital in the form of finance that comes into the economy, that can go out of the economy. So we live in a world in which there is globalization of capital, including globalization of finance. But on the other hand, the states that we have are nation states. The government that we have, the Indian government, is elected by people who are Indians, who are citizens of India. The French government is elected by people who are citizens of France. And therefore we have a world in which there are nation states, and each nation state has its own government, but we have globalized finance and globalized capital. Now, this has a very important implication. Suppose the government does something that finance does not like. Suppose the government tomorrow says that we are going to raise taxes, corporation taxes we are going to increase. In that case, you would have an outflow of capital into that economy. Not only an outflow of investable capital, but also an outflow of finance. And if you have an outflow of finance, then of course the economy can come to a very serious financial crisis. Therefore, in a world in which you have globalization of capital flows, including financial flows, but you have the nation state, whether you like it or not, the nation state pursues those policies which capital, this globalized capital and finance like. Now, as long as they remain part of this, as long as the economy remains a part of this globalized financial flows, the economy would necessarily, the government would necessarily pursue these policies. If it did not, then there would be capital flight. Therefore, it is not that the government withdraws, but the government intervenes in the economy and pursues those policies which are liked by globalized capital. And globalized capital is naturally corporate capital. It's not as if small producers or in Kerala are investing abroad. But of course, the Ambanis are investing abroad, the Tatas are investing abroad. So globalized, they are the ones globalized. So the government necessarily does those things which globalized capital and globalized finance want. It is not a withdrawal of the state, but it is a change in the orientation of the state, where the state does things which are actually demanded by capital. Now, obviously, what does the state do? If it is the case that the state does not invest, the state does not even run a fiscal deficit. Many of you would know that in India we have a Fiscal Responsibility Act, which says that 3% of the GDP is the maximum fiscal deficit you can have. We don't have an act that actually says, is there that let us say 20% of GDP is the minimum level of taxation. We don't have an act that says that education and expenditure on education should be a certain minimum percentage of GDP. We don't have an act that expenditure on health should be a minimum percentage of GDP. Why do we have an act that actually says fiscal deficit can only be a certain percentage of the GDP? We have that act because that is what globalized finance demands. Why do they demand that? Difficult question, but basically they want the state to provide a proper atmosphere for them so that they can make investment instead of the state itself doing a lot of spending or a lot of investing, etc. So basically, the first thing to note about neoliberal economic policies is that they do not entail a withdrawal of the state from the sphere of the economy, but they entail an intervention by the state of a different kind from this sort of intervention that occurred earlier in the Nehruvian period or in the Indira Gandhi period, etc. The state no longer is an investor, the state no longer spends a lot, but the state actually creates conditions, creates incentives so that private capital can undertake investment. Why is it that we actually have a land ordinance? Land ordinance is in order to make it, easier to facilitate for things for private capital. There was a time, in fact, you'd be surprised to know, the country from which maximum foreign investment comes to India, direct foreign investment, is, guess what? Is Mauritius. Now, how is it that Mauritius is the biggest source of direct foreign investment into India? It is because India has a double taxation avoidance treaty with Mauritius, which says that if Mauritius government levies taxes, then Indian government will not. All the American and British and European corporations have a Mauritius office, and therefore they channel investment in India through Mauritius so that India does not tax them on the grounds that Mauritius has already taxed them. But Mauritius has zero tax rates. It doesn't tax. As a result, it's a way of avoiding taxes. There was a time when Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister, today's president. He brought in, he took a decision that from now on, we are going to see all these companies that are making profits in India and evading taxes from Mauritius, we're going to see if actually their headquarters are in Mauritius or if their headquarters are in some other country. If their headquarters are in some other country, then unless they have paid taxes there, we are going to tax them. And immediately there was a hue and cry. Naturally, the government had to withdraw. This is an example I'm giving about how globalization of finance and globalization of capital flows force every government to pursue the same kinds of policies which we call neoliberal policies, which on the one side mean that their government actually extends support, gives tax breaks to the capitalists, makes it easier for them to acquire land, makes sure that labor legislation is controlled, labor force is controlled, etc. On the other side, there is a second misconception about neoliberalism. The first misconception, as I said, is that the government does intervene, but in a different way. The second misconception is that the second way that the government's intervention changes is that the government withdraws supporting the small producers because it is supporting the large ones. You see, let me just go a little into the background. When India was fighting an anti-colonial struggle, particularly in the 1930s, when that struggle took off, it took off because the peasantry in large numbers started joining the anti-colonial struggle. Why did the peasantry start joining the anti-colonial struggle? Because of the fact that during the depression of the 1930s, you know that during the 1930s, there was a big depression all over the world, because of which the prices that peasants were getting crashed. Terms of trade moved against the peasantry and so on. They got into debt, there was desperation, there was really acute peasant distress. It is during that period of distress that they came increasingly to the anti-colonial struggle, and one of the promises of the anti-colonial struggle was that we are not going to allow that distress again to visit the peasantry in free India. And as a result, a number of steps were taken in independent India so that the government came to the support of the peasantry and of small producers generally, fishermen, craftsmen, and so on, weavers, etc. What were these measures? Let's look at some of the measures the government did to support the peasantry. Firstly, international price crashes were not allowed to come into the Indian economy because there was a control over trade in agricultural products, exports and imports, because of which our price system was insulated from the world price system as far as agriculture was concerned. Inside the country, the government actually provided remunerative prices in 22 crops, food crops, and at those remunerative procurement prices, the Food Corporation of India used to buy up whatever the peasants offered to sell. You also had a situation where there were all kinds of boards, coffee board, rubber board, coconut board, coir board, and so on, coir board, which intervened in order to ensure that for commercial crops also, if there was a price crash, these boards intervened to make sure that the peasants got appropriate prices. There was an increase in government expenditure and investment in irrigation, that there was also subsidization of a whole range of inputs as far as the peasants were concerned, like fertilizers, electricity, and so on. After bank nationalization, credit was also provided at subsidized rates to agriculture. So the government entered in very many ways to support peasants and to support small petty producers. Neoliberalism, in the name of the government's withdrawing from the economy, does not actually withdraw because it supports big capital in very many different ways, has withdrawn support from all these petty producers and peasants. How? You find that now there is a withdrawal increasingly of the subsidies the government used to give. Nationalized banks are still supposed to provide a certain part of their credit to agriculture, which is priority sector lending. But what is priority sector has been so widened that if you give a loan for buying a scooter, in that case, that too is considered priority sector lending for agriculture. When I was in Kerala, I used to travel around quite a lot. So I came to Kasaragod or Kannur or somewhere. So I went to talk to some bank people. And the bank people told me that they meet the priority sector norms. That means the proportion of credit that should go to agriculture. But privately, they told me, sir, for the last 18 months, we have not given a single agricultural loan. At the same time, therefore, if banks don't, private banks never bothered to even meet priority sector norms. So if banks don't give loans, in that case, the peasantry goes to all kinds of private money lenders. When they go to private money lenders, they are charged exorbitant interest rates and they get into debt trap. So you find that there is a withdrawal of support of that kind through, for instance, the kind of subsidized inputs the peasants used to get. As far as procurement is concerned, once more you find that all these commodity boards have been wound up as far as their marketing function is concerned. Currently, in Gujarat itself, peasants are in acute distress, and that's the Prime Minister's own state, because groundnut prices have crashed. So there is no support as far as they're concerned. Prices crash. When prices crash, they cannot pay back their loans. Agriculture, because of this double squeeze of withdrawing subsidies from inputs and at the same time not providing remunerative prices, not assuring, has lost profitability. Agriculture is no longer a profitable occupation, and of course in particular years when peasants have acute distress, they have committed suicides, and you have had more than 3 lakh suicides over the last 20 years. So this is the second aspect of neoliberalism, namely a withdrawal of support by the state to small producers, alongside the fact that the state now increasingly woos the large producers. You know that the current government is having a Make in India program. What is Make in India? It is actually providing incentives of various kinds to big producers to come and invest in India. Therefore, the idea is that you actually provide incentives to the big capitalists, to big producers, but you withdraw support from the small producers. Again, when I was in Kerala, in the planning board, we did an exercise that suppose every fisherman in the state actually got the statutory minimum wage that the state had at that time, then you would find that the entire fisheries sector in Kerala would be having negative rates of return. That means the sector had survived because the fishermen took a daily earning that was lower than the statutory minimum wage of the state. So you can see the kind of squeeze that has been imposed as far as petty production, small production is concerned. This is an extremely important issue, but is not generally recognized. And this is something which is a very important part of neoliberal economic policies. Now put these together and find out what exactly does it mean. What it means is that since agriculture and a whole range of small producers, just go anywhere in India, the Banarasi silk weavers are in crisis, the fishermen in Kerala are in crisis, the peasantry is in crisis everywhere, including in Modi's own state, Gujarat. So everywhere there is a pervasive crisis as far as the small producers are concerned. When there is this crisis, many of the small producers, peasants let us say, they linger on. Okay, they take an income cut, but they stay on. Others who actually do not stay on migrate to the towns, migrate to the cities, and they migrate to the cities in search of jobs, because after all these incentives being provided to big capitalists bring about a growth rate because they do some investment. Now, the jobs that they come to look for are not being created. Even though India is supposed to be a very rapidly growing economy, the amount of employment creation has been minimal. Let me give you an idea. You see, again, this gets camouflaged, because how do you know what is employment creation? It's not an easy thing to define. How do you know that employment has or has not been created? I'll give you an illustration. I mentioned earlier the 1930s Great Depression in the entire capitalist world. During that Great Depression, a lot of the unemployed people who had, workers who were working in factories that closed down, they became shoe shine boys. They would sit by the roadside to shine shoes because they had lost their jobs. Now, you could say that there is a terrific boom in the shoe shine industry. There's an enormous growth of employment in the shoeshine industry. So in order to define unemployment, economists have a term, disguised unemployment. Those shoeshine boys were actually disguised unemployed, or they are unemployed in disguise. So in order to define employment, you have to get rid of disguised unemployment. One way that you can do, I mean, in India, for instance, we have every 5 years the National Sample Survey. And that goes around asking people, do you believe your usual status is one of being employed or being unemployed? And if someone says that, look, my usual status is being employed, then he's counted as employed. That's one way of actually getting rid of disguised unemployment to find out proper employment. And you find that between 2004, 5 and 9, 10, which was a period when the economy was growing very rapidly, 7-8% growth rates per annum, the rate of growth of usual status employment per annum was 0.8%. Now, the population growth is about 1.5%. The workforce growth would be roughly about the same. And therefore, the rate of growth of usual status employment, which means proper employment, was lower than the natural rate of growth of the workforce. And if it is lower than the natural rate of growth of the workforce, then think of the displaced peasants, the displaced petty producers who are streaming into the cities in search of jobs. Censuses show that the number of peasants has gone down between censuses. So they are streaming in for jobs. Obviously, they don't get the jobs they're coming for. So put these two together. On the one hand, there is a squeeze on petty production. On the other hand, there is an increase in unemployment, and jobs are not being created to absorb even the natural rate of growth of the workforce, let alone those who are getting displaced because of the squeeze on petty production. Now, unemployment can exist in very many different forms. Even open unemployment can exist in very many different forms. It may be, let us say, imagine an economy in which there are 100 people, only 50 jobs. Now, you can have either only 50 people being employed and 50 being unemployed. That is the way that we normally visualize unemployment. The other thing you can have is that everybody is unemployed for half the time and employed for half the time. Now, the latter is what one would call casual employment. Therefore, the growth of unemployment in India is one which is manifesting itself increasingly in the form of casualization of work. These days, you do not find in very many, even big factories, a workforce that is actually employed with some rights there, but you find a casual workforce. I'll come back to this casualization in a moment. But just imagine, so you have on the one hand a squeeze as far as petty producers are concerned, and you find that jobs are not growing, so that when they are squeezed, they have no other place to go to. As a result, they come into the cities, and in the cities there is, in one form or another, a growth in unemployment. If there's a growth in unemployment, naturally that puts a downward pressure on the absolute level of real wages, including even of the organized workers. As a result, the entire group of people who consist of workers, whether organized or unorganized, peasants, fishermen, craftsmen, weavers, etc., is one which is, taken in its totality, becoming absolutely worse off in the neoliberal era. Now, again, this is something which is not often highlighted, discussed. You must have seen planning commissions saying poverty is going down and so on. If they are becoming absolutely worse off, it is natural that the magnitude of poverty must be increasing. And it is in fact increasing. Let me kind of give you some figures and also tell you why people don't recognize it to be increasing. In India, poverty is defined in the following way. If there is anybody who actually does not access 2,200 calories per person per day in rural areas, or 2,100 calories per person per day in urban areas, such a person is defined to be poor. Now, obviously, it's not as if people are only eating calories there. They're having all kinds of other expenses. So what they do is that they actually look at a situation where what is the level of expenditure at which a person accesses that many calories. Okay. Now, obviously, that level of expenditure is called the poverty line. So then you kind of, do the poverty line, and how many are below poverty line, implying how many are below that calorie norm. You can actually calculate for every 5 years, when the National Sample Survey provides you with data, you can actually calculate how many people are below that calorie norm. When you calculate, you find that there is an increase both in rural and in urban areas in a very significant manner of the percentage of people below these norms. I'll first tell you a story, then I'll give you a figure. The norms, the increase was so phenomenal when the government looked at 2009-10 National Sample Survey data. Every 5 years, 2004, 5, 9, 10, they said, look, this is going to be terrible. So even though this National Sample Survey is supposed to happen once every 5 years, they actually ordered a special National Sample Survey for 2011-12, which was a good crop year. 9-10 was not so good. So they thought this would bring down poverty. So let me actually take 2011-12 figures, the so-called optimistic figures. If you compare 2011-12, the proportion of people below 2,200 calories per person per day in rural India, and compare it with the beginning of neoliberalism. And the earliest we have National Sample Survey close to the beginning of neoliberalism, which in India was in 1991, is 1993-4. In 1993-4, 1993-4, yeah, that's right. 58% of the total rural population did not access 2,200 calories per person per day. In 2011-12, 68% of the total rural population did not access that. And this, despite the fact that you actually have MGNREGS now. This despite the fact that in lots of states, including Kerala, you have subsidized rice being distributed to the public distribution system and so on. Even so, there is an increase in the percentage between 93-4 and 2011-12 from 58 to 68%. For urban areas, 2,100, 57% to 65%. So again, unambiguously, there is a worsening. Now, what the government does is that it does not look at this. This is the way, naturally, this is what common sense would suggest, and therefore this is the way that one should be looking at poverty, but they say no. We had a poverty line in the year 73-4 when we started all this. Let's use a price index and bring up that poverty line, a base-weighted price index, and let's see how many people fall below that. Now, naturally, if you have an underestimation of the extent of price increase, which for a variety of reasons I didn't go into, you do have, in that case, you would actually find, one very obvious reason is that those days there was a lot of public health care. These days, public health care is something which is collapsing, and therefore people are increasingly forced to go to private health care, and this shift entails larger payments which are not captured in the price index. So the price index, which underestimates inflation, therefore understates the poverty line, therefore fewer people are below it, and therefore poverty is underestimated. But for economic reasons that I have discussed, the change in the nature of state intervention, the government's withdrawal of support as far as the petty producers, peasant agriculture is concerned, and the lack of creation of jobs in the towns, together have basically meant a situation where an increase in poverty, in absolute poverty, is something which we should be expecting, and indeed that is what is happening. As a matter of fact, on this matter of food consumption, I'd like to just go back a little. At the beginning of the 20th century, British India, the per capita food availability, per capita net availability of food grains in British India annually was roughly about 200 kilograms per year, annually. That declined sharply to about 148 kilograms by the time of independence. In fact, just before independence, it had fallen even more sharply to about 136 kilograms. Very sharp drop. And we know that that drop produced the Bengal famine and so on. There was very acute distress as far as the peasantry is concerned. And generally also, before the introduction of statutory rationing, as far as the urban population is concerned. But there was a general increase in malnutrition and hunger in the last 50 years of colonial India, which was quite phenomenal. After independence, with a great deal of effort, the post-independence government, our independent government, brought it up somewhat. So that just before economic liberalization, just before neoliberal policies were introduced at the end of the 1980s, it had come up to about 180 kilograms for India as a whole. Still not as good as at the beginning of the century, but nonetheless an improvement compared to the time of independence. After that, during the neoliberal period, it has declined. It has declined where today, I mentioned 11, 12 and so on, these good agricultural years. If you take the average for the period between, of the 3 years, 11, 12, 12, 13, 13, 14, for which we have data, it comes out 162 kilograms per year. So that you have not even reached the level where you were when neoliberalism began. As a result, it's not surprising that hunger and malnutrition have increased quite sharply in the country, and since poverty is defined in those terms, there has been an increase in absolute poverty. I should mention two technical points here, which I'm sure you would kind of appreciate. The first is that you may say, but look, I mean, when I become better off, I don't eat more kind of rice, I don't eat more kind of chapatis, I don't eat more kind of dosas and so on. So why should we worry if people's consumption of these things are going down? When I say consumption or absorption, I should make one thing therefore very clear. As people become better off, their direct intake of food goes down. They don't eat as much of bread or as much of rice, they actually reduce that. But their indirect intake of food grains goes up because food grains in the form of animal feed, food grains in the form of processed food, cornflakes and so on, that goes up. So that if you actually look at the United States has an annual per capita food grain intake of 800 to 900 kilograms compared to 162 for India I was talking about. Europe has about 600-700 kilograms. So that you find that actually direct and indirect absorption of food grains increases as people become better off. The figures I have been quoting are figures of direct and indirect. Calories in any case would capture everything. And even the other figure of per capita net availability that I was talking about for British India and subsequently for independent India refers to direct and indirect. Therefore, quite indubitably, there has been a worsening as far as malnutrition and hunger is concerned, and therefore one can infer that there has been a worsening as far as poverty is concerned. And this is part of the logic of a neoliberal economy for reasons that I have just been talking about. The other side of it is a kind of social implication, which I want to now talk a little about. During this entire period, as I mentioned, since jobs are not increasing, you have increasing casualization of labor. When you have increasing casualization of labor, it becomes very difficult for workers even to sustain trade unions. As a matter of fact, many of you may know that around Delhi, there has been for some time an agitation by Maruti workers, and that agitation is about one issue, that we want to have a union in which non-casual and casual workers both are members. And this is something which the management is not allowing. Casual workers are in such a condition that trade unionists say that earlier you had factory gate meeting, 5 o'clock the factory shift would be over, workers would come out, then trade unionists would get hold of them, there'd be speeches and so on. These days, if you are even seen handing over a leaflet to a casual worker, he's thrown out immediately. As a result, with growing casualization, the unionization of workers naturally is something which is adversely affected. There's a second thing that is happening. All over the world, you find one very interesting phenomenon. Namely, workers in the public sector are more unionized than workers in the private sector. I mean, in America, for instance, if you take education, I mean, if you include the education sector, then you find that roughly 1/3 of total public sector employees are unionized, while for the private sector, that is only about 8%. One of the reasons that France has such strong trade unions is because in France there is still a very substantial public sector. In India, because of the fact that there is a certain privatization that has taken place of public sector activities, for instance, the railways, which were a very major force, very major, largest employers, now a whole lot of their services are actually outsourced. So you find that there is a substitution of private sector for public sector activities, and that has been one factor which actually has adversely affected unionization. As a result, you find that even though poverty and so on are increasing, the capacity for resistance is something which is going down, certainly as far as the working population, working people in towns and so on are concerned. Now this of course has one very important implication for democracy and so on, but this has another very important implication, and that has to do with the fact that, you know, that collective forms of organization in trade unions and so on are ways in which people go beyond their caste, communal, religious differences. A trade union is one in which a Hindu worker and a Muslim worker, a Brahmin worker and a Yadav worker, etc., they all come together and they do a strike or whatever. The moment you have collective forms of struggle of that kind going down, then it becomes easier for identity politics to take over. Identity politics, whether it's caste identity politics or whether it is communal identity politics of the sort that we're actually finding in India today. And this, of course, creates conditions for the growth of fascism, which is the kind that we observe. Now, this neoliberalism, therefore, on the one hand, generates increasing poverty, on the other hand, actually fragments the working class and fragments people generally from collective forms of life into individualized, self-centered forms of life. But even this neoliberalism has actually now run into a crisis, and that's the last thing I'll talk about, then we'll open up. How long do I have? How long do I go on? I mean, when does the session end? Okay, all right. So I'll just take 5. You know, in 2008, the entire world economy got into a very serious crisis, which is still continuing. By the way, that crisis is still continuing. In Europe, you find that the crisis continues. In the United States, where they say the crisis is not continuing, look at the unemployment rate, it has come down. That's because of the fact that a number of people have dropped out of the workforce. You know, when there is a lot of unemployment, people don't even report for work. That is called the discouraged worker effect. But if you take the same workforce to population ratio as prevailed in 2008 and apply it to today, then you'd find in the US itself there's 9% unemployment, which is very high. So generally you find that all over the world the crisis has been going on. Why has it been going on? Why is there a crisis at all? You see, if you have globalization of capital, I come back to the point I started with, then naturally American capital would invest in low-wage countries like China or Vietnam or India or whatever, in order not just to produce for the American or Chinese or Vietnamese market, but to produce for the world market. When that happens, naturally their profitability is larger. When that happens, job creation in America actually gets affected. American workers then are competing against Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai, Malaysian workers. And since in countries like China, Vietnam, Thailand and Malaysia and India, there are still large numbers of unemployed people. I was just talking about unemployment in India. Their wages remain tied to some subsistence level. Since their wages remain tied to some subsistence level and American workers are competing against these workers, their wages also don't increase. As a matter of fact, therefore, you find all over the world, the average wage of the workers is not really increasing. Some increase in China, but if you look at other countries, and in the United States, according to some estimates made by Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, if you look at the real wage rate of a male American worker in 1968, and you compare it with the real wage rate of a male American worker in 2011, then you find that it has declined marginally. So everywhere, therefore, the real wages are not going up. On the other hand, labor productivity is increasing. If labor productivity is increasing and real wages are not going up, that means the non-wage income, the surplus, the profits increase as a proportion of output. Now, therefore, while wage incomes as a proportion of output are going down, non-wage profit incomes or surplus incomes as a proportion of output is going up. Now, if you shift a rupee from a worker to a chap who earns the surplus, in that case, while the worker would have consumed that entire rupee, the chap who derives his income from surplus would consume, let's say, 50 paise out of it and put the remaining 50 paise for later consumption. Therefore, every such income redistribution gives rise to a shrinking of demand. A shift from wages to profits entails a shifting of demand. It's a very well-known proposition in economics, goes back to Sismondi and Malthus, early 19th century. Anyway, so therefore, this entire globalization phenomenon, on the one hand, has kept wages tied down to some absolute level. I'm not saying the American workers' wages are the same as the Chinese or Indian workers' wages, but they're not increasing. Labor productivity is increasing everywhere. So on the one hand, income inequalities are increasing. On the other hand, you also have a situation where demand for the output that is produced is shrinking. And that shrinking of demand is something which was camouflaged for a while because of all these bubbles that happened in the United States, housing bubble and so on. But once the bubbles collapse, the underlying problem of the economy becomes clearer, more manifest, and that problem continues. There is no suggestion today in the world economy either for a redistribution of income in favor of the workers and in favor of the poor, nor is there even a suggestion that the state should deliberately act to promote demand, because, as I mentioned, finance, globalized finance, does not want too much of state intervention against itself. It would rather the state provided it with incentives. And in America, as you know, they had provided with incentives 0 rate of interest. In Europe, in Scandinavia, negative rates of interest to make capitalists, to induce them to invest, but still they don't. Crisis continues. The state cannot directly invest because that undermines the legitimacy, social legitimacy of the capitalist system. Therefore, globalized capital doesn't want it, and therefore you have the persistence of a crisis. In this persistence of the crisis, naturally, people are becoming restive. They are sick and tired of this entire neoliberal regime, and they are looking at alternative possibilities. Somebody called Donald Trump, who's supported by a bunch of, and mind you, this creates conditions for the growth of fascism. Somebody called Donald Trump who comes and says, oh, you know why your condition is bad? Because the Chinese are stealing your jobs. Because the Mexicans are stealing your jobs. Then at least he's using a different language compared to the liberal establishment that was presiding over neoliberalism, that actually even didn't recognize the problem and said everything would be okay. And consequently, people are turning towards fascism in many of the countries. But in other countries or in other situations, after all, against Donald Trump, there's Bernie Sanders, who also had an alternative agenda, alternative left agenda, in which he was talking about controlling Wall Street, which means controlling globalized finance and so on. And he also acquired a fair amount of popularity. So you find now that the old neoliberal regime is under very serious challenge and threat. There is, alas, over large stretches of the world at this time, a move towards fascism. On the other hand, if an alternative is provided which also promises people an improvement in their living conditions, then they do come to that alternative. But at the same time, such an alternative, a progressive, non-fascist alternative, would have to reckon with the fact that it would be opposed by finance capital, because the moment you have a progressive alternative that wants to enlarge the benefits to the working population by, let's say, taxing the rich, then capital would start flowing out of your country. They would think this is not a good enough country for us to be in. And if so, you will have to put capital flights. I mean, put controls on capital flights, because, as I said, that is what forces the nation state to kowtow to the will of capital, will of globalized finance. So, such a regime would have to reckon with the opposition of finance capital, and to reckon with this opposition, you have to build an alternative social support for these policies, and this support can only be a support of the workers, of the peasants, of petty producers, craftsmen, etc., etc. And for that, it has to provide very concrete suggestions about how it is promising to, how it is proposing to improve their conditions. Therefore, I would say that the world today is in a very critical situation where the old neoliberalism, for reasons I've been discussing, has now become discredited. In its place, a kind of fascism is emerging everywhere, including here. But if you want to thwart this fascism, then you have to have an alternative agenda. That does not mean a return to the neoliberal agenda, but that actually does mean some restrictions on the movements of capital, some restrictions on the caprices of finance, so that you can genuinely deliver some kind of benefits as far as the working people are concerned.